Welcome, students. This is Institutional Racism 0225. I'm Kamal Ali. I'm going to be taking this ride with you over the next 16 weeks. Hopefully, they will be interesting and productive weeks. There certainly is a lot of relevance to teaching a course that tackles the issue of institutional racism in America and beyond, for that matter. Given the current atmosphere, what's going on globally, the uprisings, the pattern of very public killings of black men and boys in this country that has been the spark that has ignited this global interest and global unrest and trying to right the wrongs of America's original sin. I just want to give you a little background on the course, what I think I'm trying to do, what I've been trying to do with this course for some years now. I've been teaching it since 1976. I was a graduate student at UMass. I was asked to teach in graduate school a course on racism, and in fact, in some ways, I inherited it from the Center for Racial Understanding at UMass at the time. I put my own spin on it, which was influenced by my mentor at the time, Professor Bob Suzuki, a Japanese scholar who I was fortunate enough to have as my mentor when I first came up here from New York to go to UMass. And I learned a lot from him, and all of which I'm going to share with you in some shape, form, or fashion, because the stuff that I learned from him in the 70s is still relevant today. Believe me, and you'll find that out as you go through the course. Let's see, I've taken a few notes because I want to talk to you a little bit. I want to be specific. I don't want to ramble on. The goals of the course have changed over time. I was initially interested in, and this is the 70s, 80s. I came to Westfield State in 81. I immediately began teaching, although I was an administrator. I was the director of Minority Affairs. My background is multicultural education. And like I said, that Bob Suzuki was a known and still renowned figure and had written many books on the subject and was a practitioner himself for a variety of reasons. But I was more interested in, at that time, I guess, in having my students just simply understand what was going on. I mean, you don't know, I can't say what you don't know. Let me put it this way. In 1981, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, came into the office of the presidency and immediately began to unravel all of the great advantages, the great goals and gains of the civil rights movement with respect to voting and education, all of which, by the way, were signed into law by a president who was a former Dixiecrat from Texas. His name was Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson was responsible for the Voting Rights Act, for the Elementary Education Act, Secondary Education Act, which brought into fruition programs like Upward Bound, the state funds that came initially from the federal government that started programs like urban education, all signed into law by a white guy who was a former, I can't say racist, but after the death of Kennedy, he was the one to put forth a program called the War on Poverty, which you'll learn about in the course that I'm about to teach you in some degree. At any rate, in the 80s, there was a lot of ambiguity, a lot of sort of like shadows things going on with respect to what should people of color do in response to the systemic taking apart of the scaffolding that buttressed the civil rights gains of the 60s. So that made my course, even then, or I should say at that time as well, very relevant. Students wanted to know what's going on. I've tweaked it a little bit over the years, of course. I've got a lot of things to share with you. My wife is a professor of nursing at AIC and has a lot to say about the effects of racism or inequality, I think is the way they deal with it in nursing. There's a very good film that I'll share with you that deals with whether or not inequality is making us sick. Of course, some of us know the answer to that now because the coronavirus has not been kind to people of color who have pre-existing conditions that are brought on by this status of living in poverty and not having access to health care and other the advantages that people have who live in the mainstream. So, to be specific, I think that it's important for you guys to understand what we're going to be dealing with. So the litany of issues, the pattern, the the minefield that people of color and poor whites, by the way, have to navigate is all about issues of voter suppression, um, which we're dealing with, of course, right now. You see what's going on with respect to the White House and the systemic um, obstacles being put in the path of people who intend to vote. With the mail voting is going to be very important by mail this go around with the presidential election. And if you listen to the news at all, and I hope you do, I'm going to impose on your time by assigning at least 3 times during the course of the semester that you watch a program called Democracy Now!, which is the only popular, easily accessible media presentation that's not controlled by corporate interests. And of course, because of that, it has a certain flavor, and I'll talk about that later in some detail. Issues of voter suppression, mass incarceration. I'm the imam at the Hampden County Sheriff's Department. I'm hired by Mike Ash, and I've been there for some 20-some odd years working with the Muslim inmates, predominantly and especially. And so I'm very connected with this issue of mass incarceration, its effect on people of color, particularly black and brown people, from a first-hand 22-year plus personal involvement. The resegregation of schools, big issue. I don't know if people understand this the way I do. I'm kind of long in the tooth, been around for 40-some odd years, working very hard in Brooklyn and in New York City and Harlem, and working as an imam then as well at Rikers Island and the Bronx House of Detention and so forth and so on. So I'm very familiar with, by indoctrination, by what we say praxis, the practice of doing something. So I actually had to practice in those institutions. I got to know them intimately and still do. Desegregation of schools, mass incarceration, the inequities in the justice system, which are rampant in the court system, and we have to really begin to focus on that, and I will focus on that because in my humble opinion, all of the marching and the protesting and the putting of one's life in jeopardy by getting in the face of the police is all for naught if something tangible doesn't come out of that. And in my humble estimation, again, it's about the changing of policies, of laws, and cultural and social practices in business and in the various institutions. I mean, if you view, as I do, the country's institution as sort of an arc, wherein there's politics and there's healthcare and there's the economic system and athletics and the media, and in the center of that, the center stone, the keystone is education. So we're going to look at this issue of racism from that perspective, and examining various aspects of the institutional network. Also, we're going to look at redlining, the predatory loans of banks, not allowing people of color and poor people access to funds to buy a home. I mean, you'll find that in the course, if you don't know it already, that the most valuable purchase that you'll ever make, most likely, is your home. If you own a home and you're paying a mortgage, ultimately you will own that home outright, and that home has value. It's a source of wealth. The equity in the home can be used to give your kids a relatively free college education, to buy a bigger home and earn more equity. And that aspect of home ownership has been denied to people of color for 70 or more years. We're going to talk about that in great detail. Again, the financial system, the banking system, the colorization of wealth, why it is that people of color have approximately 1/12 the wealth of white folks. Wealth is whatever you have that's valuable. It has value, worth, monetary value in particular, against what your indebtedness is. That number is called wealth. It's not about paychecks. People can have paychecks and still living in apartments. They don't gain equity. They don't gain wealth. They have cash. They have a bank account. And if they invest wisely, maybe they can make a few dollars in the stock market. But for most of us in this country, our wealth is in our homes. Our homes, it is said, are our banks. Without a home, you don't have that bank. We're going to talk about that in great detail, how it is that black folks end up having 1/8 to 1/12 the wealth of white people. the disproportionate, of course, killing of people of color, black men and boys, in the social injustice system, is how I refer to it, because it is unjust and it is unfair. It is a dual system. In fact, society in America is class oriented, and it certainly is racially oriented. We're going to talk about the fact that race doesn't exist. I'll spend a lot of time on that. There's no such thing as race. In other words, there's no science to race. There's no biology that can explain the concept of race. Those of you who are religious, who read your scriptural accounts of the lives of the prophets or the spiritual entities in your religion, you will see in all of them, there's no mention of race in the Bible, the Quran, the Hindu scripts, the Quran, which I follow. Race is never mentioned. Tribe is mentioned. In other words, ethnicity is mentioned, but not race. Race becomes a term that is predominantly feminine in the English vocabulary, closely connected with the advent of slavery. With the profitability of slavery, in other words, around 1750s, the middle 18th century, the term race becomes a part of the lexicon, public speak, because certain people are associated with being of the higher races and, of course, others of the lower races. And since the people who made those classifications happened to be white, it was natural for them to put themselves at the top and for them to be, and their culture to be, the yardstick by which other cultures would be measured. So we're going to talk about these things in some detail, all in with respect to a sort of subset of learnings that I have in this course. And I get to those learnings by asking my students a very simple question. Is it natural? I mean, wherever you go in this country, you find large cities or suburban areas, rural areas, where there is a demarcation in standards of living, which is very clear in larger cities. People of color predominantly live in areas that are referred to as the slums or ghettos or poor neighborhoods. And the white majority of folk who are in the middle upper class live in neighborhoods that are comparatively more easily exemplary of a society that has a larger degree of access to wealth. Is that natural? In other words, is it natural that Long Meadow should look like it looks, with houses that are worth upwards of $500,000 to $1 million? Streets are clean, tree-lined, wide boulevard-like. Some homes have swimming pools and all the trappings of wealth of the middle and upper middle class. Whereas you don't find those things on Quincy Street or Eastern Avenue or in the north or south end. Is that natural? Is it normal? Is it expected to be that way? And if it's not, how do you explain that? Do you have the vocabulary and the understanding of institutional racism to suggest or to explain that to someone who might ask you that? And the person who asks you that question, sort of a loaded question, might think that it is normal. It's reflective of the fact that black people and Latinos are inferior. We have films that I'm going to show you that track that sort of logic or illogic. I call it delusional, of course, and because it's not natural. And I can tell you, and I'm going to show you why it's not natural. It's not normal. It represents hundreds of years of pseudoscience, of a distortion of history. There's another expression that I was referring to someone today, when people talk about statistical evidence for whatever and whatever. And I said, among scholars there's this notion that figures don't lie, but liars figure. The implication, of course, being that you can skew data in any direction you choose to if you're talented enough to do that. If you understand the nature of psychometrics, you can prove almost anything in a way that will pass some sort of standard, not a scientific standard, by the way, not an objective standard, but a standard that will pass muster in the minds of people who are looking for evidence to support a society that on its face is unfair, repressive, violently lethal, and has been a society from which has been very difficult for people of color to extricate themselves from in any socioeconomic way. So those are essentially the things that I wanted to share with you early on to get you vibing on on what we're going to be doing. And I smile when I say that because